The snow fell in thick curtains across the valley, muffling the distant thunder of artillery. Christmas Eve had arrived on the front lines, not with hymns and candlelight, but with the harsh crackle of radio static and the acrid smell of cordite hanging in the frozen air. Corporal Rebecca Hayes crouched behind a half-collapsed stone wall, her breath forming white clouds that dissipated into the darkness. Somewhere across the ridge, a portable radio played a tinny version of Silent Night, the melody distorted by interference and distance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in Alpha Company. "All I want for Christmas is to not get shot," muttered Private Jensen, his hands trembling as he loaded magazines with practiced efficiency despite the cold. Lieutenant Marcus Brennan stood at the command post, a makeshift shelter of sandbags and canvas, studying topographic maps by the glow of a red-filtered flashlight. The operation had seemed straightforward during the briefing advance through the valley, secure the ridgeline, establish observation posts before dawn. Simple. Clean. Nothing about war was ever simple. Rebecca adjusted her position, her standard-issue rifle resting across her knees. She'd been with Alpha Company for 6 weeks now, transferred from another unit after budget cuts and reorganization. 6 weeks of being the new face, the outsider, the one who hadn't earned her place in the informal hierarchy that governed every military unit. The wind picked up, driving snow horizontally across the landscape. Through the swirling white, flares arced into the sky at irregular intervals, casting the world in shades of red and orange before fading back to monochrome darkness. Each burst of light revealed the same thing: empty terrain, rocks, snow, the skeletal remains of trees stripped bare by previous bombardments. "Sierra Team reports nothing on the eastern approach," a voice reported over the radio. "Copy that," Brennan replied, his voice steady but edged with the tension everyone felt. Rebecca had learned to read that tension during her previous deployment. It was the feeling that preceded contact, the sixth sense soldiers developed when things were about to go very wrong. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Sergeant David Chen appeared from the darkness, his face obscured by layers of cold weather gear. "We're moving in 10. Final equipment check." Rebecca stood, her muscles stiff from the cold. Around her, 24 soldiers prepared to advance. They checked weapons, adjusted gear, exchanged the looks of people who'd fought together before. She remained on the periphery of those moments, still the outsider, despite 6 weeks of shared misery. "Hayes," Chen called, "your rear guard with the support element." She nodded. Expected. The new transfer didn't get assigned to the spearhead on a night like this. What she didn't expect was what came next. Chen approached, carrying something wrapped in a thermal blanket. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the long, elegant form of an M110 semi-automatic sniper system. The weapon gleamed dully in the scattered light from the command post. "You ever qualified on one of these?" he asked. "Yes, Sergeant." "Good. Hold on to it, just in case." He handed her the weapon, along with 2 magazines of match-grade ammunition, then moved on to check the next soldier without another word. Rebecca stood there, holding $70,000 worth of precision weapon system, understanding exactly what just in case meant. It meant they didn't trust her to use it. It meant she was a backup plan for a backup plan. It meant that on this Christmas Eve, in the middle of a war zone, she'd been given the most important tool in the arsenal to carry, not to employ. She slung the rifle across her back and followed the column as they prepared to move out into the killing darkness. The temperature continued to drop as the night deepened. Rebecca's thermal layers kept her core warm, but her extremities ached with cold despite the insulated gloves and boots. Around her, soldiers stamped their feet and flexed their fingers, trying to maintain circulation in preparation for the movement ahead. Private First Class William Crawford moved past her position, pausing briefly. "First real op with Alpha Company," he said, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his lower face. "Don't worry. Stick with the plan. Follow the veterans. You'll be fine." His tone carried the condescension of someone who'd been with the unit for 8 months and considered himself a seasoned warrior. Rebecca simply nodded, conserving energy and avoiding pointless conversation. The command post's lights dimmed as Brennan and his team leaders completed their final coordination. Through the falling snow, Rebecca could see the lead elements forming up. Weapons ready, faces grim with the knowledge of what lay ahead. Somewhere in the distance, an explosion bloomed orange against the night sky. Artillery, miles away, pounding some other objective. The war was everywhere tonight. 1,000 small battles fought by exhausted soldiers in frozen valleys and snow-covered hills. All elements. "This is Sierra 1. Brennan's voice came across the radio network. "We move in 5. Maintain interval. Watch for the signal flares. Rules of engagement are weapons tight until we confirm hostile contact." Rebecca checked her personal equipment one final time. Rifle clean, loaded, selector on safe, sidearm chambered round, safety engaged. Medical kit fully stocked. Water frozen solid in her canteen, useless until she could thaw it. Ammunition, 6 magazines for her carbine, 2 for the M110. The M110 felt heavy across her shoulders, a constant reminder of her status, not quite trusted, not quite excluded, somewhere in between, holding equipment she might never be allowed to use. At exactly 2,300 hours, Alpha Company began to move. 23 soldiers advancing through hostile territory on Christmas Eve, each one hoping to see Christmas morning. The column moved out in tactical formation, soldiers spaced at 5-meter intervals to prevent a single explosion from devastating multiple personnel. Rebecca walked near the rear, her position dictated by her role with the support element, rather than any tactical consideration of her skills. Lieutenant Brennan led from the front, a decision that earned him respect from the enlisted ranks. He'd proven himself during the autumn offensive, earning his position through competence rather than academy credentials alone. Behind him moved Staff Sergeant Gregory Phillips, the unit's designated marksman, carrying his own scoped rifle, a weapon he'd personalized over 3 years of combat operations. That's where the logic became clear to Rebecca. Phillips was the shooter. He'd been with Alpha Company for 3 years, had 2 confirmed kills beyond 800 meters, and possessed the trust of every soldier in the unit. He was supposed to provide overwatch from the ridge while the rest advanced into the valley. She was the spare part, the contingency, the person who'd hold the better weapon if Phillips needed to switch, or if his rifle malfunctioned, or if he took a round and someone needed to grab his gear and continue the mission. "Don't take it personal," Crawford had told her 2 weeks earlier, during a conversation that had attempted to be comforting but landed somewhere closer to patronizing. "It's just how it works. You gotta earn the shot." Phillips earned his spot. "You'll get yours eventually." Rebecca hadn't argued. She'd simply nodded and continued cleaning her rifle, letting Crawford believe his wisdom had been appreciated. The column descended into the valley, boots crunching through crusted snow that had been melted and refrozen multiple times. The temperature had dropped to somewhere around -15 Celsius, cold enough that exposed skin would suffer frostbite in minutes. Rebecca kept her focus on the terrain, watching for the irregularities that might indicate mines or improvised explosives. The radio crackled. "Sierra 1, this is command. Weather's getting worse. Satellite imagery shows the storm system intensifying. Expected to peak around 0200 hours. Copy. Command. We're committed to the operation." Committed. The word hung in the air like a prayer or a curse, depending on your perspective. They were too far forward to abort without being caught in the open during retreat. The only option was to press forward to the objective and hope the tactical advantage outweighed the environmental disadvantages. Private Daniel Martinez moved past Rebecca's position, his face barely visible beneath layers of cold weather gear. He was carrying extra ammunition for the squad automatic weapon, the heavy boxes distributed across multiple soldiers to spread the load. He gave her a brief nod acknowledgement without commentary, the most she could expect as the new transfer. At 2,345 hours, the column reached the planned overwatch position, a rocky outcropping that provided clear lines of sight across the valley floor. The elevation advantage was significant, approximately 200 meters above the valley's lowest point, with sight lines extending several kilometers in multiple directions. Phillips immediately moved to establish his shooting position, unpacking a bipod and spotting scope with efficient movements born of countless repetitions. He worked in silence, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the cold and the darkness. Brennan gathered the team leaders around him, speaking in low tones that barely carried beyond the small circle. Rebecca remained at a respectful distance, understanding that the real decisions were being made by people who'd earned the right to make them. After 5 minutes, the meeting concluded. Brennan's voice came across the radio network. "Phillips has overwatch. Main element advances on my mark. Support element maintains position at overwatch site." Rules of engagement: remain weapons tight until confirmed hostile contact. Sergeant Chen approached Rebecca directly. Hayes, you remain here with the support element. Phillips is primary sniper. You hold the M110 as backup. Thompson will maintain radio contact with command and the main element. Winters has medical support. Questions? No, Sergeant. Good. Phillips has tactical authority over this position. Follow his directions. Chen moved off to join the main assault element, leaving Rebecca with her assigned role. The support element consisted of herself, a radio operator named Specialist Kevin Thompson, and a combat medic named Sergeant Sarah Winters. Their job was to hold the rear position, maintain communications, and provide emergency fire support if needed. Thompson immediately set up his radio equipment, arranging the components with the careful attention of someone who understood that communication failures killed people. Winters organized her medical supplies, checking inventory by touch in the darkness, making sure she could locate any item instantly if casualties started arriving. Phillips glanced at the M110 on Rebecca's back. If something happens to me, he said quietly, his tone professional but not friendly. You know what to do with that? Yes, Staff Sergeant. Good. He returned his attention to his scope, already scanning the darkness ahead. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. I'd hate for Christmas to be remembered as the night we had to rely on backup plans. The comment stung slightly, but Rebecca kept her expression neutral. Phillips wasn't being malicious, he was simply stating the reality of their situation. Backup plans existed for when primary plans failed, and nobody wanted primary plans to fail. The main element prepared to move out. Rebecca watched them file past the overwatch position, 20 soldiers moving toward an objective they couldn't see, trusting in navigation equipment and training to guide them through the dark. As the last soldier disappeared into the snow, Phillips settled into his shooting position with the finality of someone preparing for a long watch. Thompson hunched over his radio equipment, maintaining the communication link with command. Winters sat with her back against a boulder, conserving energy while remaining ready to respond instantly to any medical emergency. Above them, the snow continued falling, erasing tracks, muffling sound, turning the world into a white void where distance and time lost meaning. Christmas continued. Elsewhere, families gathering, children sleeping, in anticipation of morning, churches holding midnight services. But here, on this frozen ridge, Christmas was simply another night where survival required vigilance and luck in equal measure. The first indication of trouble came at 00:17 7 hours 17 minutes after midnight on Christmas morning. Contact front. The radio transmission exploded through the silence, followed immediately by the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing across the valley. Phillips snapped his rifle toward the source of the sound, scanning through his scope with practiced efficiency. I've got muzzle flashes. Multiple positions, approximately 1,200 meters, northwest bearing. More transmissions flooded the radio frequency. Voices overlapping, some calm, others edged with adrenaline that no amount of training could completely suppress. Taking fire from elevated positions. 3, maybe 4 machine gun nests. We're pinned. Say again, we are pinned down. Rebecca felt her heart rate accelerate, the familiar surge of combat hormones, sharpening her senses. She'd been through this before. The sudden transition from routine operation to life-threatening crisis. The mind adapted quickly, or didn't adapt at all. Through her rifle scope, she could see the tracers now, brilliant streaks of light arcing through the darkness. Red tracers enemy fire, green tracers friendly return fire, though significantly less volume. The enemy had chosen their ambush site perfectly high ground, overlapping fields of fire, with the main element of Alpha Company caught in the valley floor with minimal cover. This is Brennan. We need suppressive fire on those positions, now. Phillips began engaging targets, his rifle barking in steady rhythm. Each shot was deliberate, controlled, the product of years of training and combat experience. But Rebecca could see the limitation immediately. The enemy positions were entrenched, protected by rock and prepared fortifications. Small arms fire would suppress, but not eliminate them. Thompson maintained communication with command, his voice steady despite the tension. Sierra 1 is in contact with enemy forces, estimated squad-sized element in prepared positions, requesting fire support. Negative on fire support. Sierra 1, command responded. Weather conditions have grounded all aircraft. Artillery support is available, but danger close to your current position. Coordinates required for fire mission. Brennan's voice came back, frustrated but controlled. Negative on artillery, we're too close to enemy positions. Friendlies would be in the blast radius. Minutes passed. The volume of fire from the valley increased as Alpha Company attempted to fight their way out of the kill zone. But the geometry of the situation was brutal. Every attempt to advance or retreat exposed soldiers to machine gun fire from multiple angles. "We've got casualties," Winters said quietly, listening to the medical frequency. "At least 4 wounded, 2 serious." Rebecca continued scanning through her scope, cataloging enemy positions, trying to understand the tactical picture. The ambush was professionally executed, not random opportunistic fire, but a coordinated operation planned and rehearsed. Someone had studied this terrain, identified the optimal killing ground, and positioned forces to exploit it. The first machine gun nest was positioned at approximately 1,150 meters behind a natural rock formation that provided excellent protection. The gunner fired in disciplined bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, conserving ammunition while maintaining steady pressure on Alpha Company's position. The second nest sat approximately 200 meters to the right of the first, at a slightly different elevation. This created interlocking fields of fire. Soldiers who took cover from one position exposed themselves to the other. The third nest was harder to spot, positioned in what appeared to be a depression or foxhole. Rebecca caught glimpses of muzzle flash, but couldn't get a clear view of the actual position. Phillips continued engaging, his shots forcing enemy gunners to duck and interrupting their rhythm. But it wasn't enough. For every second he suppressed one position, the other 2 maintained fire. At 0034 hours, the transmission that changed everything crackled across the radio. Lieutenant Brennan's voice, still controlled but carrying an edge that Rebecca had never heard before. The edge of someone who'd calculated the odds and didn't like the result. "Command, this is Sierra 1 actual. Without air support or artillery, we're not making it through the night. Repeat, we are not making it through the night." The silence that followed that transmission stretched for 5 seconds. Then, command responded, and Rebecca could hear the strain in the controller's voice. "Understood. Sierra 1. Continue to hold position. We're working on options." Options. The word felt hollow in the face of the reality unfolding in the valley below. Thompson looked up from his radio, his face illuminated by the green glow of his equipment. His expression was carefully neutral, but Rebecca could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. "Running low on ammunition," a voice reported on the tactical frequency. "At current rate of fire, we've got maybe 20 minutes before we're down to sidearms." 20 minutes, 1,200 seconds, each one counting down toward a moment when Alpha Company would be defenseless in a kill zone. Phillips fired again, his rifles cracked sharp in the cold air. Another enemy gunner forced to duck, another momentary pause in the incoming fire. But temporary pauses weren't victory. "Sierra 4 has 2 wounded who need immediate evacuation." Medic Specialist Harrison's voice came across the medical frequency. One with severe bleeding, the other with possible internal injuries from blast impact. Winters tensed, her hand moving unconsciously toward her medical kit. But there was nothing she could do from the overwatch position. The wounded were 1,500 meters away, pinned down by enemy fire, unreachable. Rebecca shifted her position slightly, her eyes scanning the terrain with renewed focus. The M110 sniper rifle rested heavy against her shoulder now, no longer just a piece of equipment to carry, but a tool waiting for purpose. She'd been holding it for 90 minutes, had carried it through the snow and cold, had accepted it as a symbol of her status in the unit's hierarchy. Now, as Alpha Company fought for survival in the valley below, she began to wonder if the rifle had been waiting for her all along. Rebecca moved to a different vantage point, 30 meters to the right of Phillips's position. The tactical situation demanded multiple observation angles, and she'd learned long ago that staying useful meant anticipating needs before they were voiced. Through her scope, she studied the enemy positions with methodical precision. 3 distinct machine gun nests, positioned in a rough triangle that created interlocking fields of fire. Smart, professional, the work of people who understood how to hold terrain against a superior force. But there was something else, something that nagged at the edge of her tactical awareness. The machine gun nests were firing in patterns that suggested coordination, Not just individual crews responding to targets, but a unified defense orchestrated by someone with oversight of the entire position. The kind of coordination that required a command element, someone watching the battlefield, making decisions, directing fire. She scanned the terrain beyond the machine gun nests, looking for anything that might indicate a command post. The wind gusted, driving snow into her face. She blinked it away and continued her assessment. Behind her conscious analysis, memory surfaced unbidden. A training range in Georgia, 5 years ago. She'd been 22 years old, fresh from basic training, when an instructor named Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Morrison had watched her shoot. "Most people think sniping is about the rifle," Morrison had said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd proven their expertise in places where mistakes meant body bags. "It's not. It's about patience, calculation, and the willingness to take responsibility for the shot when it matters most." Rebecca had qualified expert marksman that day, had shot tight groups at distances that impressed even Morrison. But the real lesson had come later, during a classroom session that felt more like philosophy than tactics. "There will be moments," Morrison had continued, "when the chain of command breaks down, when the person with the best shot isn't the person in charge. Those moments test everything you believe about authority, duty, and initiative." Morrison had paused then, looking at each student in turn. Some of the most important shots in military history were fired by people who weren't given explicit orders. They simply recognized what needed to be done and possessed the moral courage to act. But understand this, that courage comes with responsibility. If you're wrong, if the shot fails, you own that failure completely. Nobody will share that burden with you. Rebecca had thought about that lecture many times over the intervening years. She'd wondered if she would recognize such a moment if it arrived, and whether she'd have the courage Morrison described. Now, crouched behind a boulder on Christmas morning, while 23 soldiers fought for their lives below, the question had transformed from hypothetical to immediate. She continued scanning, her scope moving slowly across the terrain in a grid pattern that ensured nothing was missed. The enemy positions were visible through their muzzle flashes and the occasional illumination from flares. But command elements rarely positioned themselves in the direct line of fire. Then she saw it. A flash of reflected light, approximately 2,300 meters distant. Not muzzle flash, something else. Binocular lenses or a scope catching the glow from a flare. The position was elevated, above and behind the primary machine gun nest, with clear sight lines across the entire valley. Rebecca focused her scope on the area. At first, she saw nothing but rocks and snow. Then movement, subtle, careful, the kind of disciplined movement that came from military training. A figure shifted position, and she caught a clearer view. One person, possibly two, in what appeared to be a prepared observation post. No visible weapons fire from that position, which suggested they weren't engaging targets directly. They were observing, coordinating, commanding. She checked the range with her scope's built-in laser rangefinder, being careful to activate it only briefly to avoid revealing her position. 2,947 meters. She rechecked. Same reading. Nearly 3 kilometers. At night. In snow. With wind gusting to 30 kilometers per hour. It was an absurd shot. The kind that existed more in legend than reality. The kind that required not just skill, but luck, divine intervention, or both. But from her position, with the M110's capabilities, it was technically possible. More importantly, it was the only shot with a high elevation angle that might achieve what Phillips couldn't, eliminating the person controlling the ambush rather than just suppressing individual positions. Rebecca's mind shifted into the analytical mode that had served her through years of training. Emotion retreated. Personal concerns about authority and hierarchy faded. What remained was a tactical problem requiring a technical solution. The enemy command element was coordinating the ambush. Remove that coordination, and the individual machine gun nests would lose their unified effectiveness. They'd still be dangerous, but they'd be fighting as independent units rather than as a synchronized defense. Phillips was engaging targets at 1,100 to 1,200 meters with his standard designated marksman rifle. Effective, but limited to suppression rather than elimination, given the enemy's protection. He couldn't reach the command element. It was beyond his weapon's effective range, and his position didn't provide the angle needed to engage the elevated target. But Rebecca's position did. She had the angle, she had the weapon, she had the training. What she didn't have was authorization. "Hayes, you got eyes on anything from your position?" Phillips's voice came across the radio. She keyed her microphone. "Possible command element, bearing 315 degrees, approximately 2,900 meters, elevated position above primary enemy nest." There was a pause. Then, Phillips responded, "That's beyond my effective range. Can you get a better observation?" "Already observing." Confirmed 1, possibly 2 personnel in prepared position. No direct engagement, appears to be coordination role. Another pause. Rebecca could almost hear Phillips calculating, considering options, running through the same tactical analysis she'd already completed. "Maintain observation," he finally said. "Let me know if they relocate." It wasn't authorization. But it wasn't prohibition either. Phillips had acknowledged the target without explicitly instructing her not to engage. In the valley below, another wounded soldier called for medical evacuation. The clock continued counting down toward the moment when Alpha Company would run out of ammunition and options. Rebecca settled into position behind her boulder, the M110 now resting solidly on its bipod. She began the calculations that would transform an impossible shot into a technical challenge with quantifiable parameters. Rebecca retrieved a small notebook from her pocket, the pages protected by a waterproof cover. She'd kept this notebook through 3 deployments, filling it with data that most soldiers never bothered to learn. Ballistic coefficients, temperature effects on different powder types, wind drift calculations at varying distances. The M110 fired a 7.62x51 mm NATO round with a 175 grain Sierra Match King bullet. She knew the ballistics by heart, had memorized the data during countless hours of study. But at 2,947 meters, she was operating at the extreme edge of the weapon's theoretical capability. The manufacturer's specifications listed the maximum effective range at 800 meters. What she was contemplating was nearly 4 times that distance. She observed the snow falling around her, watching the angle and speed of individual flakes. An old trick, taught by Morrison. Snowflakes revealed wind patterns more accurately than any mechanical gauge, especially when you learn to read them across multiple distances. Near ground level, the wind moved steadily from the northwest at approximately 20 kilometers per hour. But at mid-elevation, perhaps 500 meters up, she could see the flakes swirling differently. The wind shifted more westerly and increased in speed. At the target's elevation, based on the snow patterns at that distance, the wind appeared to be gusting to 35 kilometers per hour. She'd have to account for drift across multiple wind zones, each affecting the bullet's trajectory differently. Next, temperature, -15 Celsius. Cold air was denser than standard conditions, which would slow the bullet and increase drop. Her standard ballistic calculations assumed 15 degrees Celsius. She'd need to compensate for the 30-degree temperature differential. The bullet would take approximately 3.7 seconds to reach the target. During that time, the Earth's rotation would affect the trajectory, the Coriolis effect. At this latitude, shooting north, the effect would push the bullet slightly right. The calculation was complex, involving latitude, direction of fire, and distance. But she'd studied it enough to make a reasonable estimate. Approximately 8 centimeters right at this distance and direction. Elevation was another challenge. The target sat approximately 200 meters higher than her position. Uphill shots required different holds than flat shooting because gravity's effect on the bullet changed with angle. The general rule was to aim slightly lower than the horizontal distance would suggest, but at extreme range, the calculation became more nuanced. Rebecca opened her notebook and began writing. Not full sentences, just numbers and abbreviations that would mean nothing to anyone else but contained everything she needed. Range, 2,947 meters. Temp, 15C versus standard. 15C equals 30C delta. Wind, W20 kph, at 0 to 300 meters. WNW 28 kph, at 300 to 800 meters. W35 kph at 800 meters plus. Elevation, plus 200 meters, target above shooter. Direction, 315 degrees, northwesterly. She calculated bullet drop. At 2,947 meters in standard conditions, the 175-grain bullet would drop approximately 85 meters from the bore line, but cold air would increase that. She estimated an additional 4 meters of drop. Total drop, 89 meters. But the uphill angle reduced effective drop. She calculated the angle approximately 3.9 degrees. Using the cosine of that angle, the effective drop would be closer to 88 meters. Wind drift was more complex. She broke the distance into zones and calculated drift for each zone based on the wind reading for that altitude, then summed them. The math took 3 minutes of careful work in her notebook. Zone 1, 0-800 meters. NW 20 kph equals 0.4 meters left drift. Zone 2, 800-1,800 meters. WNW 28 kph equals 1.2 meters left drift. Zone 3, 1,800-2,000, 947 meters. W35 kph equals 2.1 meters left drift. Total drift, 3.7 meters left. But that assumed consistent wind direction. The westerly component would push the bullet right, while the northerly component would push it. She recalculated, accounting for the vector components of the wind at each zone. 5 minutes later, she had a refined estimate. 2.8 meters right, 1.2 meters up, the vertical component of crosswind. Add the Coriolis effect, additional 0.08 meters right. Final holdover, 2.88 meters right, 88 meters elevation, compensated for uphill angle. She closed her eyes and visualized the shot, saw the bullet's arc through the dark air, watched it drift right, drop down, curve slightly from the Earth's rotation. Mental rehearsal had been another of Morrison's teachings. The mind needed to believe the shot was possible before the body could execute it. When she opened her eyes, she began making precise adjustments to the M110 scope. The weapon had been zeroed for Phillips, who shot differently than she did. She'd have to trust that his zero was accurate and build her calculations from that baseline. Phillips had zeroed the rifle at 300 meters standard practice. From his zero, she needed to add approximately 88 meters of elevation adjustment. The scope had 1/4 MOA clicks. She calculated the number of clicks needed, then dialed them in with careful precision. The windage adjustment was more difficult because it crossed multiple zones. She settled on 2.9 meters right as her holdover, accounting for all wind drift plus Coriolis. She extended the rifle's bipod and settled into a prone position behind the boulder. The rock provided shelter from the wind and a stable shooting platform. She checked her natural point of aim, ensuring her body position would allow her to hold steady on target without muscular tension. Through the scope, she found the distant position. The figure was barely visible, a shadow among shadows, distinguishable only by occasional movement, and the faint thermal signature her scope could barely detect at this range. The scope's reticle hovered over empty space approximately 3 meters right and high above where the target actually stood. The holdover required to compensate for all the variables she'd calculated. It felt wrong, counterintuitive, like deliberately aiming at nothing. But that was the nature of extreme range shooting. You aimed at where the bullet would go, not where you wanted to hit. Rebecca's breathing steadied. Her heart rate, elevated from the adrenaline of combat, began to slow through practiced breathing techniques. She needed to take the shot between heartbeats, in the natural pause that occurred at the bottom of exhalation. Somewhere in the valley below, a radio transmission broke through. We're down to 15 minutes of ammunition at current rate of fire. 15 minutes. Her finger moved to the trigger, taking up the slack, feeling the precise moment where additional pressure would release the firing pin. No one had given her permission to take this shot. No one had even suggested it. But Morrison's words echoed across 5 years. The willingness to take responsibility for the shot when it matters most. Rebecca's world contracted to the space visible through her scope. The distant figure, barely more than a thermal signature, the reticle floating in space above and beside it. The steady rhythm of her own breathing. She ran through the checklist one final time. Not a formal checklist from any manual, but the personal verification that separated careful shots from reckless ones. Wind reading, verified. The snow patterns hadn't changed significantly in the last minute. Range, 2,947 meters, confirmed by 2 separate measurements. Elevation compensation, Accounted for, scope dialed to calculated setting. Windage compensation, calculated and incorporated into aim point. Coriolis effect, included in windage calculation. Position stability, solid. The bipod was anchored on rock, her body relaxed into the prone position, bones supporting the rifle rather than muscles. Ammunition, match grade 175 grain, the best available for this weapon system. Confidence level, uncertain. There were too many variables, too many things that could go wrong. But there was also 23 soldiers running out of time. She exhaled slowly, completely, emptying her lungs until the natural pause arrived. Her heart beat once, twice, 3 times. In the space between the third and fourth beat, she increased pressure on the trigger. The M110 fired. The recoil was moderate, pushing back into her shoulder with familiar force. The suppressor reduced the sound to a sharp crack rather than the thunderous report of an unsuppressed rifle, but it was still loud enough to draw immediate attention. "Hayes, what are you doing?" Phillips shouted from his position 30 meters away. She ignored him, keeping her scope on target, watching for impact. Her finger moved to chamber another round, the semi-automatic action requiring only a moment to cycle. The bullet disappeared into the darkness and falling snow. Somewhere in that 3-dimensional space, a small piece of copper-jacketed lead was arcing through the night at 792 meters per second, subject to forces she could calculate but never fully control. 1 second passed. Through the scope, she could still see the thermal signature of the target, unchanged, unaware. The figure appeared to be studying something, perhaps a map, perhaps radio equipment. 2 seconds. The figure shifted position slightly, adjusting whatever they were holding, unaware that death was in flight, crossing the space between them at incomprehensible speed. 3 seconds. Rebecca's breathing remained controlled, but she felt the tension building in her chest. The mathematics were solid, the calculations were correct. But mathematics existed in textbooks, while bullets existed in a world of chaos and probability, where a single gust of unmeasured wind could turn perfect calculations into complete misses. 4 seconds. The thermal signature suddenly disappeared from her scope. Her heart sank for half a second before her tactical training reasserted itself. The figure hadn't moved laterally, they dropped, straight down, instantly, without warning. The kind of sudden collapse that came from traumatic impact to the upper body or head. She held her position, watching for confirmation, while her mind processed the implications. The bullet had traveled 2,947 meters through wind and snow and cold air, had dropped approximately 88 meters from its initial trajectory, had drifted nearly 3 meters right, and had found its target in the darkness. Did you just... Phillips had moved to a position where he could see through his own scope. Did you just take a shot at Jesus Christ? Hayes, that's 3,000 meters. Through her scope, Rebecca saw other thermal signatures converging on where the target had fallen. Movement patterns suggested confusion, concern, people responding to something unexpected. Below them, in the valley, something changed. The change wasn't immediate or dramatic. The machine gun nests didn't stop firing, but the character of their fire shifted subtly. The coordinated, disciplined bursts became slightly more erratic. Positions that had been mutually supporting began firing independently, without the precise timing that had made them so effective. Thompson looked up from his radio. Sierra 1 is reporting enemy fire is becoming less organized. Lieutenant Brennan is asking if we observed anything from Overwatch. Rebecca remained motionless, still watching through her scope. More enemy personnel were moving now, their defensive positions becoming slightly less focused on Alpha Company's location. Hayes, Phillips said, his voice different now, stripped of the casual dismissal that had characterized previous interactions. What did you just do? She finally lifted her head from the scope. Her face was numb from the cold, her fingers stiff despite her gloves. She safed the M110 and sat back slightly, maintaining her position but reducing the immediate tension in her shooting posture. Engaged command element, she said quietly. 2,947 meters. Elevated position above primary enemy nest. Phillips stared at her for a moment. Then he turned back to his scope, scanning the enemy positions. I see personnel movement at that location. Looks like they're responding to casualty. Thompson was speaking urgently into his radio. Sierra Overwatch to Sierra 1. Hayes engaged enemy command element. Long-range shot appears to have been effective. There was a pause in the radio traffic. Then Lieutenant Brennan's voice, tight with the stress of combat but carrying a note of something else. Confirm that transmission. Hayes took the shot? Affirmative, Sierra 1. Single shot, approximately 3,000 meters. Another pause, longer this time. In the valley below, Alpha Company was moving. Rebecca could see it through her scope, fire teams beginning to bound back, using the moment of confusion in the enemy's defensive coordination to extract from the kill zone. The machine gun nests were still firing, but without centralized direction, their fire was less effective. Soldiers were finding gaps, moving during pauses, exploiting the breakdown in enemy coordination. All Sierra elements, they're losing coordination. Brennan's voice came across the radio, sharp with command authority. Prepare to bound by teams on my mark. 3. You're first. 2. Provide covering fire. The tactical withdrawal had begun. Phillips was providing covering fire now, his rifle barking in steady rhythm as he suppressed enemy positions during friendly movement. But his attention was divided. Part of his focus remained on Rebecca, as if seeing her for the first time despite 6 weeks of shared operations. "How did you know?" he asked, between shots. "How did you know you could make that shot?" Rebecca didn't answer immediately. The truth was complex, and couldn't be reduced to a simple explanation while soldiers were still fighting for their lives below. Instead, she returned to her scope and continued scanning for threats, her rifle ready if another command element tried to reassert control over the enemy's defensive positions. The change rippled through the battlefield like a stone dropped in still water. At first, it was subtle. A machine gun that had been firing in precise 3 to 5 round bursts instead unleashed a longer, more desperate string of fire, the signature of a gunner who'd lost direction and was shooting at movement rather than coordinated targets. Another position ceased firing entirely for nearly 30 seconds, its crew presumably moving to investigate what had happened to their command element or attempting to establish communication with leadership that no longer existed. The third nest continued firing, but the timing was off. Without coordination from a command element, the gunner was making independent decisions based on limited visibility and incomplete tactical awareness. Lieutenant Brennan recognized the shift immediately. His voice crackled across the radio, sharp with the kind of command authority that came from recognizing a moment that could turn a disaster into a fighting chance. "All Sierra elements, enemy coordination is breaking down. Prepare to bound by teams on my mark. Sierra 3, your first movement. Sierra 2, provide covering fire. Execute." Through her scope, Rebecca watched the tactical situation evolve. Alpha Company began moving with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who drilled these movements until they became instinctive. Teams would provide covering fire while other teams advanced, then reverse the process, leapfrogging toward safety. The enemy positions tried to respond, but without centralized command, their fire became reactive rather than proactive. They shot at what they could see rather than anticipating where targets would be. The interlocking fields of fire that had made the ambush so effective began to show gaps. "Sierra 3 is moving. Copy. Sierra 2 has you covered. Sierra 4 is set. 3 bound forward." The radio transmissions became a rhythm of controlled chaos. The coordinated dance of people who'd trained together and trusted each other to execute without hesitation. Phillips had fully committed to supporting the withdrawal now, his initial shock at Rebecca's shot replaced by professional focus. Each time he fired, an enemy gunner was forced to duck, to break his rhythm, to hesitate for the crucial second that allowed friendlies to move. Rebecca shifted her aim, searching for additional high-value targets. The primary command element was neutralized, but there might be secondary leadership attempting to reassert control. She scanned systematically, looking for personnel who exhibited command behavior, coordinating others, using radio equipment, positioning themselves where they could observe the battlefield. At 0052 hours, the first elements of Alpha Company reached safer ground, a rocky area that provided cover from the remaining enemy positions. The soldiers immediately established defensive positions, ready to provide covering fire for the teams still extracting. One by one, fire teams bounded back. Some carried wounded on improvised stretchers, others dragged equipment that would have been too valuable to abandon. All of them were fighting their way clear of the ambush site with the grim determination of people who'd been given an unexpected second chance. the enemy fire diminished further. Individual gun crews were making independent calculations about risk versus reward. With their command element gone and Alpha Company extracting successfully, continuing to fight meant exposing their positions to counterattack without achieving any strategic objective. At 0058 hours, the first enemy position went silent. Not suppressed, silent. The crew had withdrawn. 2 minutes later, the second position ceased firing as well. The third held out longer, perhaps operated by more dedicated or more stubborn personnel. But at 0104 hours, that position also fell silent. The ambush was over. The radio exploded with transmissions. Head count, all teams report. Sierra 3, all accounted for, 3 wounded, 2 serious. Sierra 2, everyone's here. 2 casualties requiring evacuation. Medic to Sierra 4's position, we've got significant bleeding. Sierra 5, all present, 1 with possible concussion. Thompson was writing rapidly, maintaining the accountability roster that would determine if anyone was missing. His face was tight with concentration, understanding that mistakes in this accounting could mean leaving someone behind. Winters had already grabbed her medical kit and was preparing to move down to treat casualties once the area was confirmed secure. Her movements were efficient, professional, the result of training and experience that had taught her how to maintain composure while people's lives depended on her skills. Sierra 1 to Overwatch. Brennan's voice came across the radio. Enemy positions appear to be withdrawing, maintaining defensive posture but no longer in immediate contact. All personnel accounted for. 4 serious casualties requiring evacuation. Thompson responded, Overwatch copies, will relay to command for evacuation support. A pause. Then Brennan again. Overwatch? Sierra 1 is requesting confirmation on earlier transmission. Hayes engaged enemy command element at approximately 3,000 meters. Phillips leaned toward his radio. Affirmative, Sierra 1. Hayes identified command element at 2,947 meters, elevated position above primary enemy nest. Single shot eliminated target. Observed enemy coordination breakdown immediately following engagement. The radio went silent for several seconds. Rebecca could imagine Brennan processing that information, calculating what it meant, understanding how close they'd come to disaster, and how a single shot had changed the tactical equation. Outstanding shooting, Corporal Hayes. Brennan's voice carried something that might have been profound respect or simple disbelief, possibly both. That shot saved lives tonight. Sierra, 1 out. Rebecca safed her rifle and sat back against the boulder. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear or adrenaline, but from the delayed reaction that came after intense focus. She'd held that focus for nearly 20 minutes, from identifying the target through calculating the shot to firing and observing results. Phillips was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. 2,947 meters, he said quietly. In snow? At night? With that rifle? That's... He paused, searching for words. That's not supposed to be possible. It almost wasn't, Rebecca replied honestly. If the wind had shifted, if the temperature had changed, if a dozen other variables had been different, I would have missed. But you didn't miss. No, I didn't. Thompson finished his radio coordination with command. Evacuation helicopters are inbound. ETA 30 minutes. Weather is clearing enough for flight operations. 30 minutes. Half an hour until Alpha Company could extract with their wounded and return to relative safety. Half an hour that they'd earned through fighting, through training, through the kind of tactical coordination that turned ordinary soldiers into effective combat units. And through one impossible shot on Christmas morning, the questioning began when the main element of Alpha Company regrouped at the Overwatch position 40 minutes later. Lieutenant Brennan arrived first, his face obscured by layers of cold weather gear, but his eyes sharp and analytical. Behind him came Staff Sergeant Phillips, several team leaders, and a loose formation of soldiers who'd just extracted from a kill zone and were still processing the fact that they'd survived. Medic Winters immediately moved to coordinate with the other medics, establishing a casualty collection point where the wounded could be treated while waiting for evacuation. 4 soldiers had sustained serious wounds, gunshot injuries, shrapnel from grenades, 1 possible internal bleeding from impact trauma. None were immediately life-threatening. but all required evacuation to a proper medical facility. The count could have been far worse. Should have been worse. Given the circumstances of the ambush, everyone present understood that. Brennan approached Rebecca, who was field stripping the M110 for cleaning a task made more difficult by frozen fingers and exhaustion, but necessary to maintain the weapon's reliability. "Corporal Hayes," he said, his tone neutral in a way that suggested deliberate control, "walk me through that shot." It wasn't a request. She set down the rifle components and retrieved her notebook, now slightly damp from melted snow. Target was identified at 0034 hours, elevated position 2,947 meters distant. She flipped to her calculations, the numbers still visible despite the conditions. Wind reading indicated northwest at 20 kilometers per hour at ground level, shifting to west-northwest at 35 kilometers per hour at target elevation. Temperature, -15 Celsius, uphill angle of approximately 4 degrees. Time of flight estimated at 3.7 seconds. Brennan studied the notebook, his expression unreadable. "And you calculated all of this in how long?" "Approximately 15 minutes, sir, including range verification, wind reading across multiple elevation zones, and ballistic compensation for temperature." Phillips had joined them, along with several other soldiers from the main element. They formed a loose semicircle, listening without interruption. Some faces showed obvious respect. Others showed skepticism. A few showed the kind of exhaustion that came from surviving combat, and finding the energy to care about anything beyond rest was simply too much to summon. "Who gave you clearance to take that shot?" Brennan asked. The question was inevitable. Rebecca had known it would come the moment she'd decided to fire. The military operated on chain of command, on explicit orders and defined responsibilities. She'd acted outside that framework. "No one, sir. I assessed the tactical situation and determined the shot had a reasonable probability of success. Given the circumstances, I deemed it appropriate to attempt without awaiting explicit authorization." "Appropriate to attempt," Brennan repeated slowly, testing the words. "Corporal, that's a 3-kilometer shot in combat conditions. The M110's effective range is 800 meters. You were operating at nearly 4 times the weapon's designed capability." "Yes, sir. If you'd missed, you would have revealed our position without achieving anything. You could have compromised the entire Overwatch element to counterfire." "Yes, sir. If you'd hit a friendly position by miscalculation." "There were no friendly forces within 400 meters of the target vector, sir. I verified before firing using GPS positions from the tactical network." Brennan fell silent, studying her. Around them, the other soldiers waited, their faces showing a range of reactions, from admiration to skepticism to simple curiosity. Sergeant Chen stepped forward. He'd been with the main element during the ambush, had experienced firsthand what it meant when enemy coordination suddenly collapsed. "Sir, if I may, whatever judgment call Corporal Hayes made, it worked. We were pinned. We were running out of ammunition. That command element was coordinating fire that would have eventually overwhelmed us. When it went down, their whole defensive structure fell apart." Brennan nodded slowly. "I'm aware of that, Sergeant. I'm not questioning the outcome. I'm questioning the decision-making process." He turned back to Rebecca. "You understand this is going to generate significant paperwork, a lot of it. Command is going to want detailed after-action reports. They're going to question whether you exceeded your authority by engaging without orders. There will be an investigation into whether proper procedures were followed." "I understand, sir." "They're also going to question," Brennan continued. And now there was a slight shift in his tone. "Why the hell we didn't have you in a primary shooting position in the first place?" Phillips spoke up, his voice carrying professional respect that hadn't been present in earlier interactions. "Sir, I've been a designated marksman for 3 years. I've made confirmed kills out to 900 meters in combat. What Corporal Hayes did tonight," he paused, seeming to search for words. "It shouldn't have been possible, but it happened. I watched the target drop through my scope. She made a shot that I wouldn't have attempted because I wouldn't have believed it could succeed. The mathematics suggested it was possible," Rebecca said quietly. "Difficult, but possible. I simply executed the calculations." "Simply," Brennan repeated. And now there was definitely something in his voice that sounded like suppressed amusement. "Right. Simple 3-kilometer shot at night in a snowstorm. Not a storm, sir. Just snow. Visibility was adequate. Brennan looked at her for a long moment. Then his expression shifted slightly, the neutral mask cracking to show something that might have been approval. You did good work tonight, Hayes. Unconventional work. That's going to generate uncomfortable questions, but good work. When we get back to base, you're going to spend several days writing reports and answering questions from people whose job is to determine whether you're a hero or a liability. He paused. For what it's worth, my report is going to state that you demonstrated exceptional tactical judgment, technical proficiency, and initiative under combat conditions. You saved lives tonight. That matters more than procedural questions about authorization. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. You're still going to have to justify every decision to people who weren't here. But you'll have the support of everyone who was. Around them, soldiers nodded. Even the skeptical faces had softened. Combat created a kind of clarity that peacetime military operations never achieved. Results mattered more than procedures when lives were on the line. By 0300 hours, Alpha Company had consolidated at the Overwatch position and established a proper defensive perimeter. The storm had intensified briefly before beginning to diminish, and Command had confirmed that evacuation helicopters would arrive as soon as the weather allowed safe flight operations. Rebecca sat apart from the main group, completing the cleaning and maintenance of the M110. The weapon had performed flawlessly, but it deserved care after being asked to do something far beyond its intended purpose. She worked methodically, her cold-numbed fingers moving through the familiar sequence of disassembly, cleaning, inspection, and reassembly. Private First Class Daniel Martinez approached carrying 2 vacuum-sealed rations and a canteen of coffee that had somehow stayed warm despite the cold. He was one of the soldiers who'd been pinned in the valley, part of Sierra 4 that had taken the heaviest fire. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, offering the packages. She accepted them with a nod of thanks, setting them aside while she finished reassembling the rifle's bolt carrier group. Martinez didn't leave immediately. Instead, he sat down on a nearby rock, staring out at the snow-covered landscape that had nearly become his grave. "That shot you made," he began, then paused, as if uncertain how to continue. "I was in the valley when everything changed. When their fire pattern suddenly broke down, that's when Lieutenant Brennan gave the order to start bounding back. That's when we knew we had a chance to get out." Rebecca said nothing, continuing her work on the rifle. "I'm not saying this right," Martinez continued. "What I mean is my team was behind a rock formation, and we were down to maybe 3 magazines between the 4 of us. The machine gun fire was so constant that we couldn't move. We couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, couldn't even get to better cover. We were just waiting." He fell silent for a moment, waiting to run out of ammunition, waiting for them to flank us, waiting to die, basically. And then suddenly the fire pattern changed. It got sloppy, uncoordinated, and we had a chance. Rebecca looked up from the rifle. "You made it out because you and your team executed properly during the withdrawal. That takes training and discipline. We made it out because someone removed the person controlling that ambush," Martinez said firmly. "Training and discipline only matter if you have an opportunity to use them. You gave us that opportunity." He stood up, preparing to return to his position. Before leaving, he added quietly, "Thank you for taking that shot, for doing something when nobody told you to." "Just did my job." "No," he said firmly. "Your job was to stay in the Overwatch position and hold a rifle you weren't authorized to use. You did something more than that. You saw what needed to happen, and you made it happen. That's different." He walked back toward the defensive perimeter, leaving her alone with the rifle and her thoughts. No official recognition came that night. No immediate award ceremony. No commendation announced over the radio. No formal acknowledgement beyond Brennan's brief words and the respect visible in soldiers' eyes. The military didn't work that way, especially not in the middle of an active combat zone where survival took precedence over celebration. Awards and commendations required paperwork, investigation, verification, and processing through multiple levels of bureaucracy. That would come later, if it came at all. But something had shifted. Throughout the remainder of the night, as Alpha Company waited for dawn and extraction, soldiers found excuses to walk past her position. Some offered coffee or rations, sharing resources in the unspoken acknowledgement that combat created bonds that transcended normal military hierarchy. Others simply nodded, The wordless communication that passed between people who'd been through something together and emerged alive. Staff Sergeant Phillips spent 20 minutes asking detailed questions about her shot calculation methodology, taking notes with the serious attention of someone who recognized he'd witnessed something worth studying. "I need to understand how you read wind across that distance," he said. "Because what you did, I want to be able to do that if I ever need to." Even Lieutenant Brennan, after completing his reports to command and coordinating the evacuation schedule, stopped by to inform her that the after-action review would note her initiative and tactical judgment in favorable terms. "Though," he added dryly, "you're going to have to qualify at extended ranges now. Can't have this be a one-time lucky shot on the official record. If you can do it once in combat, you need to prove you can do it consistently in controlled conditions." "Understood, sir." "Colonel Morrison is going to want to hear about this," he continued. "Your old instructor. She's actually stationed at division headquarters now, overseeing the advanced marksmanship program. When I file my report, it's going to cross her desk." Rebecca felt a flutter of something, not quite anxiety, not quite anticipation. Morrison had been demanding, exacting, someone who accepted nothing less than technical perfection combined with tactical excellence. The idea of her reviewing this operation produced a complex mixture of emotions. As dawn approached, the snow finally began to diminish. The storm system that had grounded air support was moving on, revealing a landscape transformed by white silence. The violence that had occurred during the night, the gunfire, the casualties, the desperate fight for survival, seemed impossible in the peaceful morning light. Rebecca disassembled the M110 one final time, wrapping it carefully in its protective covering. The weapon had been entrusted to her as an afterthought, a contingency plan that nobody expected to use. She'd transformed it into the shot that saved 23 lives on Christmas morning. Extraction came at 0815 hours on Christmas morning. 3 heavy-lift helicopters settled onto the snow-covered ridge, their rotors creating a blizzard of ice crystals that reflected the pale winter sunlight breaking through the dispersing clouds. Alpha Company loaded aboard in priority order, wounded first, strapped to litters and attended by medics who'd kept them stable through the night. Then, essential equipment that couldn't be abandoned without compromising future operations. Finally, personnel by squad, with the command element boarding last to ensure everyone else was accounted for. Rebecca boarded with the support element, taking a web seat near the rear of the helicopter's cargo bay. The aircraft smelled of hydraulic fluid, aviation fuel, and the distinctive metallic scent that accompanied military equipment. As soon as the last soldier was aboard, the helicopter lifted off, the sudden vertical acceleration pressing everyone down into their seats. She watched through the open door as the battlefield shrank below. The valley where 23 soldiers had fought for their lives became a pattern of white and gray, the violence that had occurred there already being erased by falling snow. In another hour, the tracks would be gone. In a day, fresh snow would cover the positions where people had bled and died and somehow survived. The flight back to base took 45 minutes, the helicopter following a route that avoided known threat areas while maintaining altitude for safety. Most of the soldiers slept immediately, the combination of exhaustion and the helicopter's vibration creating an irresistible sedative effect. Rebecca remained awake, staring at nothing in particular, her mind processing the previous 12 hours in the analytical way that had served her through 3 deployments. She'd violated standard operating procedure, had taken a shot without authorization, without backup, without the careful planning that usually preceded sniper operations. The shot itself had been at the extreme edge of technical possibility, some would argue beyond that edge, into the realm of luck rather than skill. In peacetime, such actions might have resulted in disciplinary measures. Courts-martial had been convened for less significant violations of proper procedure, but they weren't in peacetime. At base camp, the bureaucratic machinery of the military began its work immediately. Rebecca spent 3 hours being debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted every detail of the engagement. They were particularly interested in the enemy command position, its location, setup, the personnel she'd observed through her scope. The shot itself, one intelligence officer said, reviewing her notes with the careful attention of someone building an official record, is remarkable from a technical standpoint. But what interests command more is your target identification. You recognize the tactical importance of that position when others were focused on immediate threats. Staff Sergeant Phillips was appropriately focused on targets he could effectively engage, Rebecca replied. That was correct for his role and position. I had a different vantage point that allowed observation of the command element. Still, the officer continued, it shows situational awareness and tactical thinking beyond what we typically see from someone of your rank and experience level. That's going to be noted in your file. The debriefing ended with instructions to remain available for follow-up questions, and a reminder that the entire engagement would undergo formal review. Multiple levels of command would examine her actions, determine whether they represented commendable initiative or reckless independence, and decide what kind of precedent this set for other soldiers in similar situations. Rebecca returned to her quarters, a canvas tent shared with 3 other soldiers from her unit. She stripped off her gear with mechanical motions, each piece of equipment finding its proper place through muscle memory developed over years of military service. A shower followed the base camp's facilities, provided hot water for exactly 4 minutes, a luxury worth more than gold in this environment. She stood under the spray, letting it wash away the grime and sweat and cordite residue of combat, watching the water circle the drain and wishing it could carry away the weight of decision and consequence as easily. Clean uniform, hot meal from the mess tent, scrambled eggs and bacon that was supposed to be a Christmas meal but tasted like every other meal in this place. Then sleep. The deep, dreamless unconsciousness that came after extended operations where the body simply shut down to recover from the demands placed upon it. She woke 14 hours later to find a handwritten note tucked into her gear where she'd be certain to find it. The handwriting was precise, military standard block letters that conveyed information without personality. Hayes Command wants to see you at 0800 tomorrow. Bring your notebook and be prepared for detailed questions. Brennan. The next morning, she reported to the command tent as instructed. The structure was larger than standard tents, with multiple sections for operations, intelligence, and command functions. She'd been here before for routine briefings, but never summoned specifically by name. Inside, she found not just Lieutenant Brennan but a full colonel she didn't recognize, along with several other officers whose rank insignia indicated positions well above her own grade. The atmosphere was formal, but not hostile, more like a professional assessment than an interrogation. Corporal Hayes, the colonel began, and her voice carried something familiar that made Rebecca's attention snap into sharp focus. I believe you might remember me. Rebecca looked more carefully at the face beneath the colonel's insignia and felt recognition wash over her like cold water. Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Morrison, her instructor from 5 years ago, now wearing the silver eagle of a full colonel. Ma'am, Rebecca said, snapping to attention. Morrison smiled slightly, the expression transforming her face from command authority to something more human. At ease, Corporal. I've read the after-action reports from Christmas Eve. I've reviewed your shot calculations. I've spoken with Lieutenant Brennan and Staff Sergeant Phillips. She paused, letting the moment stretch. You remembered what I taught you? Yes, ma'am. There will be a formal commendation, Morrison continued. It's going to take time to process through channels. You know how bureaucracy works, even when people want to move quickly. But I wanted you to hear this directly from me, before the official recognition arrives. What you did that night represents the best of what we try to teach. Technical excellence combined with tactical judgment and moral courage. Morrison stepped forward, extending her hand. I'm proud of you, Corporal. You took the lesson seriously. You put in the work. And when the moment arrived, you recognized it and acted appropriately. Well done. Rebecca shook her hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who'd spent decades proving herself in a profession that didn't easily grant respect. Thank you, ma'am. The Advanced Marksmanship School, Morrison said, returning to a more formal tone. Lieutenant Brennan has recommended you for the next available class. I'm approving that recommendation. You've demonstrated capability at extreme range, but that needs to be developed into consistent, repeatable skill. 3 months of intensive training, then you'll be officially designated as a sniper rather than someone who happened to make one incredible shot. I understand, ma'am. Do you? Morrison asked. And now there was challenge in her voice. Because this changes your role, your responsibilities, the expectations placed upon you. Making one impossible shot under pressure is remarkable. Being able to make difficult shots consistently, in varied conditions, with other people's lives depending on your accuracy, that's a different challenge entirely. I'm ready for that challenge, ma'am. Morrison studied her for a long moment, Then she nodded. "I believe you are. Dismissed, Corporal. Report to Lieutenant Brennan for further instructions." Rebecca saluted and left the command tent, stepping out into bright sunlight that made the snow-covered base camp gleam like something from a postcard. Christmas Day was ending, transitioning into the ordinary progression of military life, where training and operations continued regardless of holidays or celebrations. The formal commendation arrived 3 months later, during a ceremony at division headquarters conducted with the precise ritual that military organizations use to acknowledge exceptional performance. Rebecca stood at attention in her dress uniform while a general whose name she'd heard but never expected to meet read from a citation that reduced Christmas Eve to bureaucratic language designed to fit official records. For exceptional valor and technical proficiency during combat operations on 25 December, demonstrating initiative and tactical acumen that resulted in the preservation of friendly forces and the successful completion of assigned mission objectives. The words continued, professionally written and precisely meaningless in the way that official language always failed to capture the reality of cold and fear and calculations performed while people were dying. What mattered more were the conversations that had occurred in the intervening months. Staff Sergeant Phillips had formally requested she be designated as an alternate sniper for the company. "I'm not giving up my primary position," he told her with a grin that suggested professional respect rather than competition, "but I'd be an idiot not to have you as my backup. And I'd be an even bigger idiot not to learn from someone who can make shots I thought were impossible." Lieutenant Brennan had submitted multiple pieces of paperwork recommendations for advanced training, requests for equipment allocation, justifications for expanding the company's sniper capabilities. All of it pointed toward recognizing that Alpha Company had accidentally discovered a resource they hadn't known they possessed. The Advanced Marksmanship School had been exactly as demanding as Morrison had promised. 3 months of intensive training that pushed every aspect of marksmanship to extremes. Long-range shooting in varied conditions. Target identification at extended distances. Calculations performed under time pressure. The mental discipline required to maintain focus during extended operations. Rebecca had graduated second in her class of 16 students. All of them experienced soldiers selected for their demonstrated potential. The student who'd graduated first had been shooting competitively since childhood and had 7 years of military service. Coming second to someone with that background felt like validation rather than failure. But the real change was more subtle, manifesting in ways that official citations and graduation rankings couldn't capture. In Alpha Company, stories circulated through informal networks, passed from soldier to soldier during equipment maintenance, guard duty, or the endless waiting that characterized military life. Stories about past operations, legendary mistakes, moments of unexpected heroism that became part of the unit's collective identity. The story of Christmas Eve entered that rotation immediately and began transforming in the way that all stories did when passed through multiple retellings. The distance grew. In some versions, 2,947 meters became 3,000, then 3,500, eventually reaching 5,000 in the most exaggerated tellings. The conditions worsened. Light snow became a blizzard. Partial darkness became absolute blackness. One shot became 3 or 5. The enemy multiplied. A command element of 2 people became a full headquarters of 15. Rebecca heard these variations and said nothing to correct them. The precise technical details mattered less than what the story represented. That training had value, that initiative could save lives, that the person everyone overlooked might be the one who made the difference when it mattered most. 6 months after Christmas Eve, a newly arrived private named Kevin Turner was assigned to Alpha Company during a rotation of personnel. During his first week, someone told him the story, a version that involved a shot of nearly 4 miles in a snowstorm so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. Turner sought out Rebecca afterward, his expression showing the mixture of awe and skepticism that young soldiers brought to legendary stories. "Did you really make a shot at 4 miles?" he asked. 2,947 meters. She corrected automatically. "About 1.8 miles. "Oh." He looked slightly disappointed, as if the truth diminished the story. Then, his curiosity reasserted itself. But still, in the dark, in a snowstorm? Snow, not a storm. There was light from flares and some ambient illumination. Visibility was maybe 400 meters naturally, more through a scope with enhancement. Turner processed this. "How did you learn to shoot like that?" Rebecca considered the question. She could have cited training courses, practice hours, natural aptitude for mathematics and spatial reasoning. All of those were true, but insufficient to explain how someone made decisions under pressure. "I had a good instructor," she finally said, "Colonel Morrison. She taught me that shooting isn't just about technical skill. It's about understanding when the shot matters enough to accept risk, when the potential benefit outweighs the consequences of failure." "But how do you know?" Turner asked, genuinely trying to understand. "When it matters enough?" "You don't, always. You make your best assessment with the information available. You consider alternatives, you calculate probabilities. Sometimes you're wrong. Christmas Eve, I was right. But I could have been wrong, and if I'd been wrong, people might have died because I revealed our position without achieving anything useful." She stood up, preparing to return to her duties. "The important thing is being prepared for the moment when it arrives. You can't learn the technical skills during the crisis. You have to put in the work beforehand, the hours of practice, the repetitive drills that seem pointless, the studying that feels excessive. You do all of that, so when the moment comes, you have the foundation to make good decisions quickly." Turner nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the lesson in the way that good soldiers did when receiving genuine advice from experienced personnel. Rebecca walked across the base camp, past the familiar canvas tents and equipment storage areas, toward the range where she practiced daily. The M110 waited there, cleaned and maintained according to the meticulous standards Morrison had instilled years ago. The rifle was no longer a backup weapon, something handed to her as an afterthought. It was her primary tool, and she treated it with the respect that precision instruments demanded. Behind her, she heard Turner talking with another soldier, already beginning to add his own details to the story of Christmas Eve. The distance would grow slightly in his telling. The conditions would worsen by another degree. The legend would continue to expand in the way that stories did when filtered through multiple voices. But at the core of every version, one truth remained constant. When 23 soldiers needed someone to take an impossible shot, the woman they'd given a rifle just to hold had taken it. She'd calculated the mathematics, measured the wind, accounted for every variable she could identify, and accepted responsibility for the outcome. And Christmas had ended not with funerals and folded flags, but with life and lessons about what became possible when technical skill met moral courage at exactly the moment when both were needed most. The shooting never stopped after that night. Neither did the calculations. Neither did the quiet understanding that she'd been given a gift, the opportunity